When the conference organizers contacted me and asked me to do a keynote, they said, we'd like you to talk about innovation. I said, great. They said, and we'd like you to try to provide a context for all the technologies that we're going to be talking about in the conference. I said, okay. And they said, you've got 15 minutes to do it. So here we go. We're going to be moving pretty quickly. And I'm going to provide a pretty high level of a much broader context for a lot of this technological disruption that we've been talking about all day. We have a number of problems facing the globe, and specifically in Canada. I'm going to talk about the Canadian experience a bunch. So I'm going to start by defining a number of the core problems that we're facing. The first is the demographic problem. So back in 1956, there was about 8.6 or so, 8.4 workers per retiree. And of course, that productive workforce is what funds the social contract that allows retirees to be retired. By 2056, that's going to be down to 2.2. Now, the message from this problem is, of course, that those 2.2 workers are going to have to be much, much, much more productive than their ancestors were 100 years previously. So this is a very significant challenge that we've got to come to terms with. The next big challenge is the productivity problem. Since about the year 2000, Canada's productivity has been falling off quite substantially compared to our cousins down just south of the border. I've just actually recently returned to Canada. I spent most of the last 17 years at IBM headquarters down in New York. And I've come back to, I think, a great opportunity and a great time. Actually, coincidentally, I kind of left exactly when Canadian productivity fell off. So maybe that's... Anyway, just saying. But this is actually a significant problem, because if we had actually kept pace with the Americans, every single Canadian household would have $17,000 extra a year. In aggregate, that represents a vast amount of potentially productive capital, plus all of the acceleration and multiplication effects that come off of that. So this is a significant problem. There is a bit of an asterisk to this chart, because such a large portion of our economy is resource extraction. And resource extraction has undergone quite a bit of tension over the last 20 years, because it's getting more expensive to get resources that are increasingly difficult to get. You've got to figure out ways of drilling in new ways and extracting in new ways. And so a lot of our collective productivity has been sunk into the pursuit of resources that are more and more difficult to get access to. That being said, on a global basis, we have a productivity problem. We've also got a pace problem. And this is maybe the most important chart of this entire presentation. The pace problem is that the rate and pace of innovation is accelerating tremendously. It used to be about 1904 or so, that somewhere in the order of about, I don't know, well, at some point it was about 74% of the Canadian population was involved in agriculture. But of course, we now have about 3.4% of our population involved in agriculture. That's a huge, huge fundamental transition for the economy, but that transition happened over a good 100, 120 years. Some of the changes coming at us are coming at us at an increasingly rapid pace. And so the pace of innovation is accelerating dramatically. If you go and you kind of look at this, you'll actually see that it's not a completely flat curve. There are periods of sustained innovation that are interrupted every once in a while with both breakthrough innovation and disruptive innovation. And those are actually some of the most interesting game changers out there. But what's happening is that because of the pace, the effects of the diffusion of ideas, and because of the internet and because of all the various different collaborative platforms and GitHub and the like, the diffusion of great ideas is accelerating tremendously. And that's causing this curve to accelerate considerably. And likewise, in this space, we see that same sustained innovation and breakthrough and disruptive innovation happening, but the frequency that they're happening is getting compressed, and the size of those gaps is getting magnified. And this leads us to some very important conclusions. And the most important is that the kind of strategies and management practices and operational optimization practices and public policy that we need for this world are very different than the ones that we needed for that world. And so this is kind of one of the big issues, and it leads to a number of things. We'll get to the issue of kind of labor dislocation, but there's also business dislocation. Back in 1958, the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500 was 61 years. It's currently 17 years. And of course, the average tenure of a CEO was dropped just from to the year 2000, from 10 years down to less than 5 years. So we see that there's an awful lot of business churn going on as well. And so we have to start rethinking the very foundation of our economic structure to deal with this. Inequity is actually also a problem for a number of reasons. We actually are, in the global scheme of things, at least amongst our peer group, you could debate, we're certainly better than an awful lot of people, including the Americans. But we're ranked about 12th out of, well, exactly 12th out of 17 of our peer group. And inequity becomes a problem because it fundamentally destabilizes society. Bad things happen when people feel that they don't have a stake in the society. And it becomes, you have to spend more on policing, and you have much bigger fluctuations in the political dynamic, and you get into tribalization of the political sphere. And that is just a huge distraction and a huge drain on economic potential. And so inequity actually is a significant macroeconomic phenomenon that we have to deal with. There are consequences of these problems. Poverty is a very significant consequence of some of these problems and some of these challenges, and we risk exacerbating this in this age of increasing innovation, or the rate and pace of innovation. But poverty is a problem for a number of reasons. Of course, it's an ethical problem. What kind of society do we want to build? But it's also an economic problem. This represents unused potential productive capacity. And it also burdens our social welfare system. So these are real issues that we have to deal with. We also have the big issue of the left behind. There are the forces of automation and globalization and innovation have created extraordinary global wealth, but that wealth has become distributed in very inequitable ways, and there are large portions of the population, especially in smaller communities that have traditionally been built up for the last 150 years around resource extraction and refinement, that are feeling a lot of fear and anxiety. They used to have 64 stores on Main Street, and they now have 3. And that fear and anxiety manifests itself in a number of ways that are distracting and are draining of some of the resources of an economy. This leads to all kinds of social unrest. And once again, these great fluctuations and tribalization of the political landscape. It also leads to political unrest and ethno-nationalism. We see this phenomena going on around the world, and of course, politicians thinking in the kind of time frames that politicians think of are quick to exploit a lot of this fear and anxiety. And of course, this is fundamentally a challenge that we have. There are a number of potential solutions out there that we should give considerable thought to and invest some resource in pursuing. So let's take a look at a few of them. First of all, we have to understand that we're moving from a knowledge economy, one in which the value was created around the ownership of information. Right? I lived in the software industry for an awful lot of my career. And of course, the value was we owned the intellectual property and copyright around something, and we gated that to the rest of the world, and we monetized that gating. We're moving from the knowledge economy into much more of a flow economy. It's much more important to know someone and to be involved in a dialogue and a discussion than it is to know something. And we need to help train this next generation with those kinds of skills to absorb information in the flow of things. This is a very kind of fundamental construct that a lot of the rest of these solutions fall into. The next big idea is disruptive technologies. We've talked about an awful lot of these today. There's a few that we really haven't touched on that are peripheral. We talked a lot about artificial intelligence and deep learning, and of course autonomous vehicles are a big part of that. But there's follow-on, once again, challenges out of that. Driving is the second largest employer of men next to retail. What happens when 80% of that market opportunity goes away? Well, that's a really significant challenge. But of course, on the other side of that, autonomous vehicles are going to dramatically improve our utilization rates of our transportation infrastructure, and they're going to make travel a lot safer and more efficient. Smart data, big data, fast data, lots of opportunity, and all these forces are going to kind of reshape the kind of world in which we live. IoT, smart power, this is a huge issue. We're building more and more variable production and distributed production with solar and wind. And yes, we've got some new battery technology emerging as a buffer, but the great opportunity is to move to a much more variable consumption space where we have increasingly intelligent IoT-driven devices with blockchain allowing us to do micro-contracting and agree to take extra power or to cycle down or to give power back to the grid in very, very discrete contracting context. Quantum computing is going to allow us to model the folding of proteins and do drug discovery in ways and with degrees of specificity that we couldn't possibly dream of, or model all of the vehicles in a city simultaneously to optimize traffic patterns. Advanced materials, advances in the production of new configurations of graphene are going to completely change battery architecture. So there's all these kinds of amazing things that are coming at us that we certainly have to understand. Where should we invest? First of all, some of the most important fundamental breakthroughs that we've had over the last 100 years have been around communications. The great potential to take advantage of this ability to diffuse information around efficiently comes from the investment in telecommunication and data infrastructure. We need to have a national policy that says we need high-speed data, internet connections into all of the remote communities in the country. Only then are we going to give those small communities any potential to participate in the great potential of these disruptive technologies and the forces of globalization. We need to invest in a new way of thinking about education. No longer do we need to do K-12 about fundamentals and university education around optimizing your skill in a certain space so that you're productive in the workforce. We have to rethink the way that works. The World Economic Forum pointed out in a recent study that 5 out of 6 children graduating from grade 1 will be going into jobs when they graduate from university that we don't have a name for right now. We need to train a next generation of people that have lifelong learning skills, that their greatest skill that we gave them as part of our public education is the ability to learn. They'll never stop learning. They can't afford to. We need to invest in smart energy infrastructure. We need to invest in smarter transportation infrastructure. How do we utilize the infrastructure we have access to move things around? We also need to invest in efficiency, right? This is a picture from Brooklyn of what's called a passive house. It's built to a new building specification that is 90% more energy efficient. We spend collectively in Canada about $195 billion in energy. Per capita, we're the highest consumer of electricity in the entire world. We need to figure out how to invest appropriately and liberate that vast amount of potential capital out there to productive purposes, to say nothing of helping us save the planet. We need to invest in things like congestion pricing. I did a bunch of work in Stockholm with some of the engineers that built the congestion pricing system out there. Do you know that in the city of Toronto that we waste about $11 billion a year sitting in traffic? Right? We have to figure out ways of discreetly pricing our transportation infrastructure so that we, once again, can liberate not only the capital, but all of our collective productive potential that's currently sitting on the Don Valley. We have to invest in electric transportation infrastructure. This is a picture of my old car when I lived in Westchester, and that was, it was a prototype experimental thing from Honda that they actually gave me a free car for 3 years to experiment with, and then looked at all of the interesting data that I was generating about where I charged and stuff. But it really changes your world when you're starting to live in an electric transportation infrastructure world. We also have to look at efficiencies in the shared economy. We have a lot of unused capacity that we're starting to liberate, right? We're starting to look at things like Uber and Airbnb, and there's lots and lots of things that we have that for the vast majority of the time go unutilized, unexploited. We have to look to ways to liberate that potential productivity. We have to invest in urban infrastructure. We're having a massive influx into these wonderful cities, and we have 3 of the top 10 most livable cities in the entire world in Canada. This is a huge advantage that we have. but we need to really fundamentally think the kinds of infrastructures that are going to allow these cities to continue to be livable, to not produce a lot of pollution, and to make the finite transportation infrastructure that we have available to us work properly. We also need to invest in people. We talked about we talked about a demographic problem. We need new people coming into our country. But more than that, economies and societies that are truly productively innovative are those that mix and mingle points of views and experiences and cultures. That is the crucible of ideation, of innovation. And so we need to have pretty aggressive and very intelligent immigration policy. We need to rethink our investment in people around apprenticeships and retraining and transitions. Instead of thinking about unemployment insurance, we need to think about transition insurance. The norm isn't going to be that you're employed and, good for you. It's that you're going to have a new job in some relatively small amount of time. In fact, you might have a number of them and you're going to move between them. We need to develop and need to start thinking about things like guaranteed minimum income standards to allow us to succeed in this kind of new world. We need to invest in the future, government-funded research. A lot of us forget that inside of this phone, the von Neumann architecture, the touch screen, the battery, the GPS system, the Google search engine, the internet itself, the World Wide Web, all of these were built from government-funded research. We need to think about investing in innovation ecosystems. A few critical components, those of us who have studied the dynamics of innovation ecosystems, where new ideas, where new companies are born, look to these kind of 5 major areas, right? So capital dysfunction has been a challenge in Canada. It's getting a lot better. And we're learning from an awful lot of other innovation ecosystems around the world. But this, of course, is an area that we need to invest in and to think about very strategically. We need to think through the various institutions that foster the acceleration of new startups and new ideas and bringing people together. We need to think about academic research, right? So university and the great intelligence that emerges out of universities, especially research universities, are the lifeblood of new ideas and innovation. We need to think about and invest in and support things like meetups, things like this conference, where groups of people and ideas can mingle and they can be shared and provide that seed that then goes into the generation of some new, hitherto unthought of idea. We also need to think about the urban planning that supports these places where people get together. Young people are going to be working very long hours coming up with wonderful new ideas and having places where they meet and mingle and exchange ideas. This is part of, and needs to be part of our innovation agenda. Now, we have an awful lot of advantages. Canada is actually very well placed. As I said, we're a very livable country. We're a country of law and order. We've got stable economic and banking and financial systems. We have stable electrical and energy systems in Canada. It's a very diverse place, right? Toronto, in fact, is arguably the most, 52% of the people that live in the city of Toronto were not born in this country. Extraordinary. And such enormous potential. And I've lived and traveled to an awful lot of places, and monocultures are inherently problematic and antithetical to the potential of innovation. We have huge advantages here. We have a very educated workforce, a very educated population. We've got one of the top-rated education systems in the world. We have a public insurance system. Now, a lot of people will try to convince you that that's actually a burden on economic potential, but it's not in this world, right? Insurance that is tied to employment and employers, the way that it is in the US, is in fact a restriction on the free flow of labor, moving from here to there. It's an inhibitor to people going up and starting up a new company and taking risks. And so that kind of public infrastructure is a way of of helping everything, and then finally competitiveness. We have the luxury of having access to some of the biggest marketplaces in the world. We have free trade agreements in North America, we have free trade agreements with Asia Pacific, we have free trade agreements with Europe. We're one of the most free trading countries in the entire world, and we have access to all kinds of worldwide marketplaces. We have a competitive labor, well-educated labor force. So we have tremendous potential. And the real key is to kind of move forward and with some bold leadership. And this is both political leadership that tries to think beyond the 4-year cycles that we have and has the audacity to say, listen, this is the kind of country we want to build for the next 20 years, for the next few generations. And it's fundamentally different. All this, let's look back to some mythical 1950s and try to be great again the way we were 50 years ago, is craziness. This is not the world in which we're going to be living. We need to think about and hope that we can find leaders that have that vision, that audacity to try to help us build the kind of country that we want to be and we need to be. But it also means that we need business leadership and we need academic leadership that understands what our potential is and what kind of world it is that we're moving forward to. So at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about seizing the day, right? It's really about seizing the future. And that's my call to action to all of you. Let's try to seize the future together.